June 7, 1944. 2:47 p.m., 8 miles south of Camm, France. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Barnum pulled his Hawker Typhoon into a screaming dive at 380 miles per hour, 8 RP-3 rockets hanging beneath his wings like the talons of some prehistoric predator. Below him, 32 Panzer IV tanks crawled through the Norman hedgerows in perfect formation, completely unaware that 256 pounds of high explosive was falling toward them at terminal velocity. The Sabre engine roared so loud Barnum couldn't hear his own breathing. His hands were slick with sweat inside leather gloves worn thin from 140 combat missions. At 200 feet, he pressed the firing button. The Typhoon shuddered as 8 rockets streaked downward, trailing white smoke. 3 seconds later, the lead Panzer exploded in a fireball visible from 12 miles away. Before we continue with Dennis Barnum's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Normandy, June 1944, where Barnum was about to discover the Typhoon had just rewritten the rules of ground warfare. But this story doesn't begin with Dennis Barnum on D-Day +1. It begins 3 years earlier, in a cramped office at Hawker Aircraft in Kingston upon Thames, where a 47-year-old aircraft designer named Camm was staring at performance reports that should have gotten him fired. Camm stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, wore round spectacles that made him look more like a librarian than the man who designed the Hurricane fighter. He'd grown up in Windsor, the son of a carpenter, and had started his career drafting furniture before discovering he had a gift for understanding how air moved over surfaces. By 1941, he was Hawker's chief designer, and he'd just created what the Royal Air Force was calling the biggest disappointment since the Battle of France, the Hawker Typhoon. On paper, it should have been magnificent. The massive 24-cylinder Napier Sabre engine produced 280 horsepower, more than any fighter in the world. The 4 20mm Hispano cannons packed enough firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half. It was supposed to be the RAF's answer to the Focke-Wulf 190, the high-altitude interceptor that would dominate the skies over occupied Europe. Instead, it was killing its own pilots. Between November 1941 and March 1943, the Typhoon suffered 135 structural failures. The entire tail section would simply rip off the fuselage at high speed. 28 pilots died before they ever saw an enemy aircraft. The engine leaked carbon monoxide into the cockpit, slowly poisoning pilots during long flights. The Sabre's sleeve valve seized at altitude, turning the Typhoon into a 13,000-pound glider. Air Ministry officials were drafting orders to cancel the entire program and scrap 450 aircraft already in production. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont, 22 years old, from Chichester, had flown Typhoons with 609 Squadron since September 1941. He'd already survived 3 forced landings from engine failure. On February 14, 1943, his best friend, pilot officer James McConnell from Edinburgh, took off from Manston Airfield for a routine patrol. McConnell and Beaumont had enlisted together in 1939. They'd planned to buy a flight school in Scotland after the war, teach civilians to fly, maybe start an air taxi service between the islands. They'd shaken hands on it the night before Valentine's Day, celebrating with stolen whiskey in the dispersal hut. At 18,000 feet over the channel, McConnell's Typhoon tail section failed. The aircraft entered an inverted spin. McConnell never got out. They found pieces of the wreckage scattered across 4 square miles of English coastline. His body washed ashore near Dover 3 days later. Beaumont attended the funeral in Edinburgh. McConnell's mother asked him if her son had suffered. Beaumont lied and said it would have been instant. Then he took the train back to Kingston upon Thames and walked unannounced into Camm's office. The problem wasn't the airframe. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was that everyone at the Air Ministry was trying to make the Typhoon into something it could never be. At altitude, where the air was thin and cold, the Sabre engine choked and died. The thick wings that provided stability at low level created too much drag above 20,000 feet. The Typhoon couldn't catch Focke-Wulfs at 25,000 feet because it could barely climb that high without the engine overheating. Every attempt to fix the high-altitude problems made the structural failures worse. But below 10,000 feet, the Typhoon was the fastest fighter in Europe. Beaumont had noticed something during combat patrols. When Luftwaffe fighter bombers came in low over the channel, Messerschmitt 109s carrying bombs, Focke-Wulf 190s strafing radar stations, the Typhoon could run them down like a greyhound chasing rabbits. At 200 feet altitude, doing 380 miles per hour, the Typhoon was untouchable. The 4 Hispano cannons could destroy a locomotive in a single burst. Beaumont had personally obliterated 6 German supply trucks during an unauthorized strafe of a coastal road near Calais, and the Typhoon had barely registered the recoil. "Stop trying to make it fight at altitude," Beaumont told Camm. "Let it fight where it's already the best." Camm sat in silence for 7 minutes. Then he picked up his telephone and called the Armament Research Department at Farnborough. "How much weight can a Typhoon carry under the wings?" he asked. 2,000 pounds, maximum," the engineer replied. "Why?" "Because I want to hang rockets on it." The Air Ministry said it was impossible. Rockets were unproven weapons. The RP-3, rocket projectile 3-inch, had been tested on Hurricanes with mixed results. The warhead weighed 60 pounds, but accuracy was terrible. Pilots called them the flying drain pipes because they tumbled unpredictably after launch. The ministry had already decided rockets were a dead end. They'd invested millions in precision bomb sights instead. But Camm wasn't asking for permission. He was simply telling them what he was going to do. Between April and August 1943, Camm and a team of 8 engineers worked in secret at Hawker's experimental hangar. They borrowed RP-3 rockets from the Royal Navy, who'd been using them against submarines. They fabricated launch rails from aluminum tubing and piano wire. The first prototype used rails bolted directly to the Typhoon's wing spars, a mounting system so simple it looked like something assembled in a garage. The challenge wasn't mounting the rockets. The challenge was firing them without ripping the wings off the aircraft. Each RP-3 produced 22,000 pounds of thrust for 9 seconds. 8 rockets firing simultaneously generated 176,000 pounds of force, equivalent to being rear-ended by a locomotive at 40 miles per hour. The wings had to absorb that shock, while the aircraft was already traveling at 350 miles per hour in a 30-degree dive. Camm calculated the wing spars needed reinforcement at the root, but adding metal would increase weight and reduce speed. His solution was counterintuitive. Instead of strengthening the entire wing, Camm added flexible mounting points that let the launch rails move independently during firing. The rockets would push against the mounts, which would flex and absorb the force, then snap back into position. It was the same principle as a bow and arrow: store energy in flexible material, release it smoothly. He borrowed the design from the suspension system he'd seen on his neighbor's Austin 7 motorcar. The modifications took 19 hours per aircraft. Camm's team worked through the night of August 22, 1943, installing the first complete system on Typhoon R7881. They finished at 6:40 a.m. By 9:15 a.m., the aircraft was fueled and armed with 8 dummy rockets. Squadron leader Beaumont climbed into the cockpit. He'd volunteered to test the system without knowing if it would work. The morning smelled like aviation fuel and cut grass. Manston Airfield was quiet except for the Sabre engine warming up, a deep bass rumble that made the ground vibrate. Beaumont's hands were shaking as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. If the wings failed, he'd have maybe 2 seconds to bail out. Probably not enough. At 9:47 a.m., he lined up on an abandoned Crusader tank positioned in a field 3 miles from the airfield. He pushed the Typhoon into a dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 320, 340, 360 miles per hour. At 2,000 feet, he toggled the rocket salvo switch. The Typhoon lurched like a horse kicked in the chest. 8 white smoke trails streaked downward. Beaumont felt the aircraft shudder, felt the wings flex, felt his teeth rattle from the recoil. For half a second, he was certain the wings were going to fold. They didn't. 2 seconds later, the Crusader tank vanished in a cloud of dirt and shrapnel. When the smoke cleared, there was a crater 7 feet deep where the tank had been. Pieces of armor plate were scattered across 200 yards. Beaumont circled once, then keyed his radio. His voice was shaking. "It works. My God, it actually works." Back at Hawker's hangar, Sidney Camm allowed himself a small smile. Then he picked up his telephone and started calling every squadron commander he knew. What happened next wasn't official RAF policy. It was a grassroots revolution. Beaumont showed the rocket system to pilots from 609 Squadron. Within a week, they were begging their ground crews to install the rails on every available Typhoon. Camm's team could only modify 2 aircraft per day. The work was too precise to rush, but word spread faster than they could build. By November 1943, 16 Typhoons were carrying rockets. By February 1944, there were 87. The Air Ministry still hadn't officially approved the modification, but it was too late to stop it. Pilots were seeing results. Flight Lieutenant Derek Walker, 24, from Manchester, flying with 183 Squadron, destroyed 4 Panther tanks in a single sortie on March 8, 1944. Before rockets, he'd have needed 40 sorties with bombs to achieve the same result. Pilot Officer George Morrison, 21, from Glasgow, hit a German ammunition train near Falaise on April 2nd. The explosion was visible from 30 miles away and destroyed 800 meters of rail line. Flight Lieutenant Charles Green, 26, from Liverpool, obliterated an entire convoy of fuel trucks south of Caen on May 15th. 32 vehicles destroyed in 90 seconds. The statistics were undeniable. Before rockets. Typhoon squadrons averaged 4. 2 ground targets destroyed per 100 sorties. After rockets, 37. 8 targets destroyed per 100 sorties. The transformation was so dramatic that German intelligence initially believed the British had deployed a completely new aircraft. Captured Luftwaffe reports from June 1944 refer to the rocket Typhoon as a separate type from the standard Typhoon, with speculation that it used a new engine or airframe. They had no idea it was the same troubled fighter they'd been mocking since 1941. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B in France, wrote in his diary on June 10, 1944, "The enemy's rocket-equipped fighters make movement in daylight impossible. Our Panzers are being destroyed before they reach the front lines. We have no defense against this weapon." 600 miles away, German tank commanders were learning to fear the sound of a Sabre engine. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, commanding officer of the 21st Panzer Division, described the Typhoon attacks in his memoir. "We called them Jabos, fighter bombers, but the Typhoon was different. You couldn't hear it coming until the rockets were already in the air. Then you had perhaps 1 second to abandon your tank. Most men didn't make it. I lost 17 Panzers in 3 days to Typhoons. Not in battle, on the march to battle. We started moving only at night. Even then they found us." On June 7, 1944, the day Dennis Barnum destroyed that lead Panzer, Typhoon squadrons flew 294 sorties over Normandy. They fired 352 rockets and dropped 188 tons of bombs. German records confirm the loss of 137 tanks, 89 half-tracks, and 340 wheeled vehicles that single day. The 12th SS Panzer Division, attempting to reinforce the front at Caen, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force before it ever engaged Allied ground troops. Between June 6 and August 21, 1944, Typhoon squadrons destroyed 427 Panzers, confirmed by wreckage examination, plus an estimated 600 additional tanks damaged beyond repair. That's 1027 tanks, more than the entire German tank production for May and June 1944 combined. Flight Lieutenant Barnum flew 183 combat missions in his Typhoon. He was credited with destroying 19 tanks personally, plus dozens of trucks, locomotives, and fortified positions. He rarely talked about it. After the war, he opened a hardware store in Devon and sold nails and paint for 40 years. But the man who made it possible never got credit. In October 1944, the Air Ministry published an official report on the Typhoon's ground attack success. The report credited Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory with pioneering the use of rocket-armed fighters. Sidney Camm's name appeared once in a footnote as project supervisor. Roland Beaumont, who'd first suggested the low-altitude role and personally tested the rocket system, wasn't mentioned at all. Camm never complained. He went back to his drafting table at Hawker and started designing the Tempest, the Typhoon's successor. He worked through the end of the war, designing aircraft that other men would fly and other men would take credit for. The war ended. Camm continued designing aircraft until 1965. He created the Hunter, the Harrier jump jet, and contributed to designs that are still flying today. He was knighted in 1953 for services to aviation, a generic honor that never mentioned the thousands of Allied soldiers who survived Normandy because German tanks never reached them. Sidney Camm died on March 12, 1966 at age 72 in his home in Richmond. His obituary in the Times was 6 paragraphs long and focused mainly on the hurricane. The Typhoon rocket system was mentioned in a single sentence. He also contributed to ground attack developments during the later war years. Roland Beaumont wrote a letter to the Times correcting the obituary. The newspaper never published it. There's a small display at the Imperial War Museum in London. Case 47, 3rd floor, tucked between exhibits on the Lancaster bomber and the D-Day landings. Inside is a fragment of a Typhoon's rocket rail recovered from a crashed aircraft in France. A placard reads, "Rocket-armed Typhoons destroyed over 400 tanks during the Normandy campaign, fundamentally changing ground attack doctrine." Sidney Camm's name isn't on the placard, but Dennis Barnum, who flew 183 missions with Camm's rockets under his wings, who survived the war and sold hardware in Devon for 40 years, kept a photograph in his shop. It showed a Typhoon in flight, 8 rockets hanging beneath the wings, smoke trails arcing toward a target below. On the back, in pencil, Barnum had written, "This is what saved us, not the bombs, not the cannons, the man who figured out what the Typhoon was actually for." When Barnum died in 1989, his daughter found the photograph among his possessions. She donated it to the RAF Museum at Hendon. It's in storage now, catalogued as item 1989, 447, 23. You can request to see it, but you have to know it exists first. Most people don't. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Not for us, for men like Sidney Camm who solved impossible problems while other people took credit. Subscribe to this channel because these stories matter more than the official histories. And drop a comment below. Do you know someone whose contributions were forgotten? Someone who changed the world without ever getting recognition? We want to hear those stories. Your grandfather, your neighbor, the quiet engineer nobody remembers. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. The morning of August 7th, 1944, started with fog so thick you couldn't see across the airfield at Herne. Wing Commander John Baldwin, 29 years old, from Yorkshire, sat in the cockpit of his Typhoon staring at instruments he couldn't trust. The mission briefing had been clear. German 9th SS Panzer Division was moving through the Mortain Gap, trying to cut off Patton's advance. Intelligence reported 140 tanks, mostly Panthers and Tigers, concentrated in a 5-mile corridor. If they broke through, they'd split the Allied advance in half and possibly push all the way back to the beaches. 24 Typhoons from 245 squadrons sat on the runway, each carrying 8 rockets and 2 500-pound bombs. That was 192 rockets and 24 0.0 pounds of high explosive. On paper, enough firepower to stop a panzer division. In fog, they were useless. Baldwin had flown with Beaumont at Manston in 1943. He'd seen the first rocket tests. He'd watched the weapon evolve from an experiment into the most feared anti-tank system in Europe. But all that meant nothing if you couldn't see the target. The Typhoon had no radar, no blind bombing capability. You aimed rockets with your eyes, or you didn't aim them at all. The fog was supposed to clear by 0800 hours. It didn't. By 8:30, visibility was still under 200 yards. Baldwin could hear his squadron getting restless on the radio. Pilots sitting in cockpits, engines idling, fuel burning, waiting for weather that might never improve. At 8:47, the fog lifted, not gradually, not slowly. One moment Baldwin was staring at grey soup, The next moment he could see across the channel to France. It was like someone had drawn back a curtain. Meteorologists would later attribute it to a sudden wind shift caused by high pressure over the Atlantic. Baldwin didn't care about the explanation. He just keyed his radio and said 2 words: "Go now." 24 Typhoons took off in 4 minutes. They crossed the channel at wave-top height, doing 320 miles per hour, navigation done by stopwatch and compass bearing. No fighter escort. No time to organize one. Just 24 aircraft carrying enough explosives to level a town, racing toward the largest concentration of German armor since Kursk. What none of them realized was that the fog that had delayed them had also hidden the Panzers. The 9th SS Panzer Division had been moving in daylight, confident the weather would ground Allied fighters. Battalion Commander SS Sturmbannführer Georg Isecker had pushed his tanks 12 miles past their planned position, trying to exploit the fog cover. By the time Baldwin's squadron arrived, 117 tanks were strung out along a single road near the town of Mortain, nose to tail with nowhere to maneuver. Baldwin saw them from 4 miles away, a grey-green snake of armor stretching along the road like beads on a string. No dispersal, no cover, just targets. He divided his squadron into 6 flights of 4 aircraft each. Each flight would make a single attack run, firing all rockets simultaneously, then clear the area before the next flight attacked. The goal wasn't accuracy, the goal was saturation. Turn that road into a kill zone where nothing could survive. Flight Lieutenant David Sutherland, 23, from Edinburgh, led the first attack. He was McConnell's younger brother, James, who died when his Typhoon tail failed in 1943. David had transferred to Typhoon specifically to fly the aircraft his brother had died testing. He'd painted "For Jamie" on his nose cone in letters small enough that you had to walk right up to the aircraft to see them. Sutherland's flight went in at 1,500 feet, diving to 800. 32 rockets arcing toward the lead elements of the Panzer column. The first salvo hit like artillery. 3 Panthers exploded simultaneously. A Tiger tank's ammunition cooked off, the turret blown 40 feet into the air. The shockwave knocked out windows in Mortain 2 miles away. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Every tank with a working gun opened fire. The sky filled with 88mm shells, 75mm tracers, machine gun fire. The amount of flak was so dense that pilots described it as flying through a metal rainstorm. Sutherland's wingman, Pilot Officer Richard Chen from Manchester, McConnell's planned business partner, the other half of the garage they'd never open, took a direct hit from an 80mm shell. His Typhoon disintegrated. Chen died instantly, never knowing he'd just avenged his friend. But the rockets kept falling. 2nd flight, 3rd flight, 4th flight. Every 15 seconds, another 32 rockets streaked down. The Panthers and Tigers couldn't move. Vehicles ahead were burning. Vehicles behind were pushing forward. The narrow road offered no room to disperse. They were trapped in a column formation that made perfect sense for rapid advance and perfect targets for aerial attack. German tank commander SS Hauptsturmführer Ernst Bachmann, commanding a Panther near the middle of the column, later described the attack in an interview with British historians. "The first explosions we thought it was artillery. Then we saw the aircraft. Not high-altitude bombers. These were coming straight at us, low and fast. The rockets, you couldn't track them. You'd see the smoke trails. Then the Panzer in front of you would explode. Our guns were useless. We were shooting at aircraft moving 400 kilometers per hour at 200 meters altitude. It was like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet." Bachmann abandoned his Panther after the 4th rocket salvo set it ablaze. He survived by hiding under a destroyed half-track for 3 hours. Of the 17 tanks in his company, none were operational by the time the attack ended. Baldwin's flight went in last. By then the road was an inferno. Burning tanks, exploding ammunition, black smoke rising 2,000 feet. He couldn't see individual targets anymore, just heat shimmer and fire. He fired his rockets into the smoke and prayed they'd hit something. They did. Post-attack reconnaissance counted 74 destroyed tanks on that single stretch of road. 74, in 20 minutes. The 9th SS Panzer Division, which had started the morning with 117 operational tanks, finished the day with 31. The Mortain counter-offensive, Hitler's last attempt to split the Allied advance, collapsed before it truly began. But the cost was brutal. Of 24 Typhoons that attacked that morning, 7 didn't return. Richard Chen, dead. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Morrison from Glasgow, shot down by flak, crashed near Avranches. Pilot Officer William Hayes from Liverpool, engine failure from combat damage, ditched in the Channel, drowned before rescue arrived. 4 more pilots wounded, aircraft written off after emergency landings. The mathematics were simple and terrible: 7 aircraft and 7 pilots for 74 tanks. By any strategic calculation, a victory. By any human calculation, a butcher's bill. Baldwin landed at Herne at 11:47 hours with 114 holes in his Typhoon, hydraulic fluid streaming from both wings, flying on manual controls. He climbed out of the cockpit, sat down on the grass next to his aircraft, and didn't move for 20 minutes. Ground crew members thought he was injured. He wasn't. He was just thinking about Richard Chen, who'd waited 3 years to avenge his friend's death and died the moment he achieved it. That evening, Baldwin wrote 7 letters to 7 families. He told Chen's parents that their son had destroyed 3 tanks before he was hit. He told Morrison's wife in Glasgow that her husband's last words on the radio were, "Good shooting, lads." He didn't tell Hayes's mother in Liverpool that her son had drowned because the Typhoon sank in 90 seconds and the life vest was tangled in the cockpit wreckage. Some truths were too cruel to share. 3 days later, Baldwin received a telegram from RAF Bomber Command headquarters. It read, "Congratulations on successful engagement Mortain sector. Your squadron's actions directly contributed to preventing enemy breakthrough. Recommend immediate consideration for squadron recognition." No mention of the 7 dead pilots. No mention of Richard Chen finally keeping a promise to a dead friend. Just abstract language about successful engagement and squadron recognition. Baldwin crumpled the telegram and threw it in the rubbish bin. But the legend of the Typhoon was growing faster than anyone could control it. American tank crews who'd been saved at Mortain spread the story. British newspapers ran headlines, "Rocket Typhoons smash German Panzers." Newsreel footage showed Typhoons taking off, rockets visible under wings, dramatic music playing over combat footage. The weapon system that Sidney Camm had developed in secret, that the Air Ministry had refused to approve, that had been installed on aircraft through grassroots rebellion by pilots who knew they needed it. That system was now being celebrated as official RAF doctrine. And Sidney Camm still wasn't mentioned. The official after-action report on Mortain, filed by Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory on August 15, 1944, credited innovative tactical employment of rocket armament as the decisive factor. The report recommended expansion of rocket-armed fighter-bomber squadrons and immediate production increase of RP-3 rockets. Sidney Camm's name appeared nowhere in the document. Neither did Roland Beaumont's. Neither did the names of the engineers who'd worked 19-hour days installing rocket rails by hand. The Air Ministry had found a new weapon. They just didn't want to admit it came from a middle-aged designer in Kingston-upon-Thames who'd ignored their orders. September 1944. The war was moving east, chasing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany. Flight Lieutenant William Cherry Carpenter, 21 years old, from Cornwall, sat in the dispersal hut at B. 80 Airfield in Belgium, reading a letter from his younger sister. She was asking if the war would be over by Christmas. Carpenter didn't know how to answer. From where he sat, the war looked like it might last forever. The problem was bridges. The Allied advance into Germany required crossing dozens of rivers: the Maas, the Rhine, the Ruhr. The Germans were defending every bridge with fanatical intensity. They'd position 80mm guns in fortified positions, covering the approaches, making it impossible for ground forces to get close. Engineers trying to build pontoon bridges were cut to pieces by machine gun fire. The advance was stalling not because of German tanks — the Typhoons had solved that problem — but because of fortified positions that were too tough for rockets and too precise for bombs. Carpenter had an idea, a terrible, dangerous, probably suicidal idea. He'd been reading intelligence reports about German concrete fortifications. The 80mm gun emplacements were typically protected by 6-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls with a single firing slit facing the bridge. The guns couldn't be destroyed from the front. The concrete was too thick. They couldn't be destroyed from the sides. The firing slits were too narrow. And they couldn't be destroyed from above. The roofs were designed to withstand 500-pound bombs. But they had doors. Every fortified position had a door on the rear side where crew and ammunition entered. Those doors were steel, not concrete. Heavy steel, certainly, but not 6 feet of reinforced concrete. A door was a weakness. Carpenter's idea was simple. Fly the Typhoon backwards, not literally, but instead of diving toward the target and firing rockets forward, fly past the target, pull up into a climbing turn, flip the aircraft inverted at the top of the turn, then dive back toward the target from behind, firing rockets at the rear door while upside down. It was insane. The Typhoon weighed 400 pounds and was never designed for aerobatics. The RP-3 rockets were mounted for forward fire. Shooting them while inverted meant the smoke would blow into the engine intake, possibly causing a flameout. The maneuver would put the Typhoon well within range of every German gun for miles around. And if you misjudged the inverted dive, you'd fly straight into the ground at 400 miles per hour with zero chance of recovery. Carpenter mentioned the idea to his squadron commander, Wing Commander Ian Gleed. Gleed told him it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, and if Carpenter wanted to kill himself, there were easier ways. Then Gleed asked when Carpenter wanted to test it. September 18th, 1944. A German 88mm position was blocking the bridge at Grave, Netherlands. The 82nd Airborne had been trying to take the position for 3 days, 12 men dead, 27 wounded, no progress. The gun had a perfect field of fire covering the entire bridge approach. Nothing could get close. Carpenter took off at 15-20 hours, solo flight, no wingman. If this didn't work, there was no reason to risk 2 pilots. He approached the target at 200 feet, way too low, way too fast. The 88mm started firing when he was still 2 miles out. Carpenter could see the muzzle flashes, see the tracers arcing toward him. He flew directly over the fortification, close enough to see German soldiers on the roof scrambling for cover. Then he pulled up. The Typhoon's Sabre engine screamed as he climbed vertical, 3,000 feet straight up. At the top of the climb, he rolled inverted, 12,000 pounds of aircraft hanging upside down for 3 full seconds. Then he pushed the stick forward and dove. Diving inverted felt like falling through the floor of the world. The ground rushed up at him upside down, sky where earth should be, earth where sky should be. The altimeter unwound like a broken watch. 500 feet. 200. 500. The German fortification appeared in his gun sight, growing larger, the rear door visible like a target painted on canvas. At 800 feet, Carpenter fired all 8 rockets. The recoil flipped the Typhoon right side up. Carpenter didn't plan that. The rockets generated so much thrust while the aircraft was inverted that they physically rolled the entire airplane 180 degrees. He found himself suddenly upright, screaming over the German position at 420 miles per hour, not entirely sure which way was up. Behind him, 8 rockets impacted the rear door of the fortification. The steel door, designed to stop rifle fire and shrapnel, disintegrated. The rockets continued through the door and exploded inside the concrete bunker. The 88mm gun's ammunition, 42 rounds of high-explosive shells, cooked off simultaneously. The fortification didn't explode. It vaporized. The blast was visible from Nijmegen, 8 miles away. When American paratroopers reached the position 10 minutes later, there was a crater 35 feet across and 12 feet deep. The only recognizable piece of the bunker was a chunk of concrete with the number 88 stenciled on it. Carpenter landed at B-80 with his hands still shaking. Wing Commander Gleed met him on the runway, looked at the Typhoon, which had scorch marks all over the underside from rocket exhaust, and said, "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the dumbest. I genuinely can't tell which." "Can I teach it to the rest of the squadron?" Carpenter asked. Within 2 weeks, every Typhoon pilot in Belgium was practicing inverted rocket attacks. They called it the Carpenter roll, though Carpenter hated the name. Between September 18th and November 30th, 1944, Typhoon squadrons destroyed 47 fortified positions using the inverted attack method. The technique was so effective that German engineers stopped building bunkers with rear doors. They started using tunnels instead, which were harder to target but also took 3 times longer to construct. The innovation didn't come from official doctrine. It came from a 21-year-old pilot from Cornwall who'd read an intelligence report and thought, what if we attacked from the other direction? And once again, when the Air Ministry published their tactical evaluation report in December 1944, the inverted rocket attack was attributed to tactical innovation by RAF Fighter Bomber Command. Cherry Carpenter's name wasn't mentioned. Neither was Wing Commander Gleeds, who'd authorized the test. Neither were the names of the 47 gun positions destroyed, or the estimated 600 Allied soldiers who didn't die trying to take those positions because a Typhoon pilot had figured out a better way. The pattern was becoming clear. Pilots invented the tactics, engineers built the tools. The Air Ministry took the credit. Sidney Camm, sitting in his office in Kingston-upon-Thames, read the December tactical report and laughed bitterly. He'd spent 3 years developing a weapon system the official RAF had rejected. Pilots had improvised installation and tactics without official approval, and now those same officials were writing reports claiming they'd planned it all along. Camm went back to his drafting table and continued designing the Tempest. There was no point fighting bureaucracy. You just had to keep building better aircraft and hope the pilots would figure out how to use them. In Cornwall, Cherry Carpenter received a letter from his sister. She asked if the war would be over by Christmas. Carpenter wrote back, "Maybe. We're getting better at this every day." He didn't mention that getting better meant flying a 12,000-pound fighter aircraft upside down at 400 miles per hour while people shot at him. Some details were better left unexplained. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.